back in Chicago, my city, my city. I love this place. So good to be here. Dude, I used to dream about being on stage at the Goodman. What? This is really wonderful. So I'm going to start my talk really dedicated to the woman who has made me the proud Mexicana and the proud American who I am. That's my mom. So I'm going to start by telling you my arrival story with my mom, which I think kind of encompasses her love of the Constitution, the First Amendment, freedom of assembly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because this is what happened when we arrived. So Dad was already here in Hyde Park, and my mom got on a plane with 4 kids under the age of 7. I mean, 4 kids under the age. A propósito, she was wearing her little kitten heels, you know. Okay. So plane ride was kind of crazy, but she managed it, looking good. And when they get to Dallas at the airport, they had to change planes in Dallas. So there's a super tall Texan immigration agent in the airport in Dallas, where my mom was giving over the green cards that we had. And he looks at everybody looks at all the green cards. And he said, "Ma'am, everything looks, by the way, I'm sorry if there are any Texans in the room. I like to play with accents." So he said, "Ma'am, I have to say, everything is fine with your papers. Everything is just fine, and you're all going to be able to come on in except for the baby." That was me. She's not going to be able to come in. She's going to have to stay here in quarantine, so you can just go ahead, but leave her, and good luck. I had a rash on. And one of the greatest lessons I learned from my mom, and I didn't know this story until many, 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 many years later, is that, you know, there's this kind of power that she has, that we all have, that kind of comes from here, and oftentimes we're quieting, you know, and this is why she was like, "I'm coming to the United States, and there are laws, and there's a constitution here." So the voice comes up, and she just, you know, almost, I imagine her reaching up to the big bicep of the Texan immigration agent. But she basically looked at me and said, "Sir, my name is Berta Hinojosa, and my husband is Dr. Raul Hinojosa, and he has a job at the University of Chicago, and we are going to be in Chicago. They are waiting for me in Chicago, and if you have to, you can call the president of the University of Chicago, because I am coming into this country with my 4 children, including the baby. Do you understand me, sir?" He said, "Yes, I do, ma'am. Come on in." So that was me several years later. And, you know, I was just trying to learn English because I just wanted to learn supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, you know, because that was like the most complicated English word. I wanted to live in Mary Poppins' world. And we were trying, you know, we were growing up on the south side of Chicago, trying to understand kind of who we were as Mexicanos on the south side of Chicago. That's my brother Raul, and you guys know where, you know what that building there? That's the Prudential Building, the tallest building in all of Chicago at that time. But you know what I realized recently is that while we were welcomed into our public school, and when my mom walked in with 4 Mexicano kids in Hyde Park to the public school there, Bret Harte, and the principal said, wait right here in the office, and he ran and he got the vice principal and the other vice principal, and they all came to me. He said, "Look, we have Mexicans!" They were so happy to have us in this public school in Hyde Park. But the weird thing was that I was also experiencing white supremacy. And I've realized now, because now we're talking about white supremacy, we thought it had gone away. Well, you know, in the 1960s, people thought it didn't exist either. There was a candidate, George Wallace, who was running for president. And he actually, I understood white supremacy. I was trying to find a basement to hide in because I knew that he didn't like people like me. So I understood that somehow, even though I was wanted at Bret Harte in the public school, there were other people in this country that didn't necessarily want me. We also felt pretty invisible from the media, even though my dad, Dr. Raul Hinojosa, may he rest in peace, my dad was a news hound. So we started getting Time magazine, we were watching Meet the Press, the news was on every night in our home. We were consuming it. We understood that this was a central part of the American experience, but we were never there. Never saw any stories about people like me, about families like ours, anything. We were totally invisible. And Dad, you know, he was a scientist. He actually helped to create, he was part of the large team of scientists that helped to create the cochlear implant. But he also didn't want to come to this country. It was my mom, again, who was like, no, viejo, vamos. Vamos, viejo. And he was like, no, 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 no quiero ir al norte. ¿Por qué me voy? Yo me quedo aquí. Este es mi país. No me voy, no me voy. But, you know, he needed work. He was a scientist dedicated, a medical doctor dedicated to research. There was not a lot of work for him in Mexico. And Dad was kind of closed. Mom was very open. That's Mom in the middle there. That's me with the pigtails. Rocking those shoes. I looked closely. I think they were from Canada. Get it? Okay. You know, Canada shoes in Mexico? The best. It was so cool. So, yeah, Mom was very open to the American experience. We were growing up in Hyde Park. There were these radical Jewish feminist intellectuals who looked at my mom like, why are you dressing your kids like that? There's more to life than making a bed perfectly. And my mom was like, you're right. And so that actually was really an interesting moment for our whole family, just this dynamic of becoming American. And my mom, this was the civil rights era. We were in Hyde Park on the South Side. So the civil rights era was, we were living and breathing it. Actually, just watching the Dolores Huerta movie, I think that Hyde Park in Chicago was one of the central places for the United Farm Workers grape boycott, because I stopped eating grapes when I was like 3, as far as I can remember. So all of this meant that my mom, in her openness, made a decision once to take us to go see a protest or a demonstration that was around civil rights. And she had to write a letter to my classroom teacher and say, I'm taking my kid out. And I remember there were a lot of kids that actually came out of this school. This was Hyde Park, after all. So what it was like experiencing democracy, even though none of us were citizens. Just my dad was a citizen. It was like street democracy. It was something that you all know touches you, and you're like, wow, this is amazing. And Mom was very open to giving us that experience. And what we were doing after, you know, kind of like 70s, was we were actually crossing borders, cruzando fronteras all the time, because we lived in Hyde Park, but every weekend we were in Pilsen. And we lived in Chicago, but every year we would drive to Mexico, all 6 of us in the station wagon, and literally crossing the border every year, and just going between Hyde Park and Pilsen, way before gentrification, actually was deep poverty, right? But there was such a sense of love and community there. It was amazing. I loved going there. And I was becoming more kind of conscious, right, of my identity at this time, a little bit more conscious. I did, in my consciousness as a young Latina, try out for Latino Chicago, the first Latino Chicago troupe, and I didn't make it, so I ended up in New York, going to school at Barnard College. Love the hair? I know. And it was actually a really interesting experience because, you know, Chicago at that time when I was growing up, even though it was we did have, you know, the Puerto Rican experience, Colombianos, but it was a very heavy Mexican city, and my Mexican identity was central. When I went to New York in 1979, there were like 3 Mexicans there. So, you know, Viva Mexico, and people were like, ¿Y qué? But actually what it did was it made me understand my pan-Latin American identity, which was incredibly transformative for me. And I had also seen in my political, you know, getting more exposed politically to what was happening with Latinos in Pilsen and in other areas. There was a newspaper that was being published, Sin Fronteras, so I understood the power of the media. So I started working at the college radio station. Love that outfit. And I was doing a show, I created a show with 10 records, and the show was called Nueva Canción y Demás. It was all political song, actually music that I got exposed to here in Chicago, when Quilapayún would come, or Inti Illimani. And I began to understand the importance of my identity as a communicator. I started to kind of, you know, expand into my Latin American bohemian experience. And it was also around this time that I was getting inspired not by any journalists in the United States, because there still were none who looked like me, but actually by Mexican women like Elena Poniatowska and Blanche Petrich, Mexican women journalists. So I began to think, maybe I could do this, maybe. And I ended up getting hired at NPR. I was the first Latina hired at NPR in the newsroom, yes. And actually, it was really the first of many firsts. So I was the first Latina hired at NPR. Then CNN came, and I was the first Latina hired at CNN. Then PBS came, and I was the first Latina correspondent at PBS, an anchor. So it's a little strange that there are still firsts that are happening at this time. And I had to kind of process that. Also because, you know, I actually don't know if I look so confident there, but a lot of the time, because I was the first, I didn't get the jokes, first of all. That was a joke. But I also questioned whether or not I knew what I was talking about. Again, there was no one who looked like me, so why should I assume that someone like me could be in a position of power in the media and own my voice? How could I get to that place of my mom kind of owning that inner power of hers when I was one in a newsroom? And I also suffered imposter syndrome. You know, I'd wake up just like, oh my God, they're gonna realize that I really am not qualified to be here one day. And the other thing that was happening was that I also began to understand my historic duty. I began to understand my privilege. I had, in fact, gone to a pretty amazing school, Barnard College. It was like a seal of approval on my forehead. I understood that. I understood that I was the first, and that made me understand the extraordinary responsibility I had to raise my voice. So I would force myself to raise my hand in the middle of that editorial meeting, even if my hand was shaking, you know, because I was the only one. So they'd all be like, what do you think? What do Latinos think? And I remember when I had to go on the air the first time, I had to make that decision, like, who am I on the air? Am I Maria Hinojosa, the way I was at Bret Hart, you know, in high school? Really? Oh, that's 7 minutes. Okay, I thought I had 7 seconds. Whew. 7 minutes, whew, an eternity. So I had to think about who I was going to be. And the first ever story that I did, a 60-second spot on the newscast of NPR in 1985 when I was an intern, you're not going to believe what the story was that I was reporting. Let's take a guess. Could it be a protest against immigration reform? Exactly. The first ever report I ever did was a group of protesters in front of INS, Immigration Naturalization Service, a service. And people were protesting because they were going to pass the Immigration Reform and Control Act. So, and I made a decision that I wasn't Maria Hinojosa, that in fact I was going to be Maria Hinojosa. And it was kind of like, you know, I was young. I was like, I'm not Maria Hinojosa on the air, I'm Maria Hinojosa. And that ended up being something pretty extraordinary because it helped me to understand this core idea of taking control of our own narrative and taking control of our own power and taking control of our own voice. And it's important because in the context that I began to understand and see myself much later as a woman of color journalist in our country, and then reading this seminal piece of work, News for All People, For All the People, The Epic Story of Race in the American Media by my colleagues Juan Gonzalez and Joseph Torres. You know, what we understood is actually that if you were a journalist, if you are a journalist of color in this country, a little bit of trust issues. I don't know, maybe in particular in the year 2017? Okay, but it has a long trajectory. So for example, when African-American reporters and journalists for black newspapers, or even for mainstream if they were, when they would want to go and report a lynching, their white news editors would say, why are you going to report that? That's not news. Or, if you go report that, you're un-American. Or if you report that, you must have some kind of a bias. Right? You must have some kind of a bias. We can't really trust you as a journalist of color in the United States of America. And that, I think, is something that I live with on a daily these days. But it doesn't mean that we stop, right? We question things. Like, for example, what's happening here, which all of my journalist colleagues and in the history books, this is called the Japanese internment. Well, actually, it wasn't an internment. Actually, it was an imprisonment of people who had never committed a crime and who were American citizens. So the language that we use does matter, right? So that clip, illegal is not a noun, there's a reason why that matters, because when you dehumanize a people, or you say, we're gonna do this for you because it's for your own good, and it's not a prison, it's an internment center. Well, not necessarily. So all of this essentially made me begin to understand that I had to own my own power. And in 2010, when I wasn't sure what my next thing was gonna be, I decided to create my own nonprofit media company. It was a big risk. I had never run anything. I remember back then when people would say, ooh, how entrepreneurial, I would be like, I'm not an entrepreneur. I don't even know what that is. I am an entrepreneur and I understand it. It's because we, again, have to own the terms and make them our own. So I created the Futuro Media Group not to make money. I created it actually as a nonprofit because money has just never been that important to me in the scheme of things. Kind of like my dad. It's about the mission. It's about the love of work. And when I created my own newsroom, we took over Latino USA, expanded it. Gee, we won a Peabody and a Robert F. Kennedy Award. Yeah. And in my newsroom, I made a couple of decisions because soy la jefa. Sometimes I call myself la pequeña jefa, but I'm still la jefa. So in our newsroom and on our air, you will never hear us use the term illegal to refer to a human being. Ever. And in our newsroom, you actually won't hear us use the term minority on the air. I'm not a minority. It's not how I think. I've never said to my two kids, kids, you are members of a minority group. Jamás. So that's what we created. That's what when we understand the capacity of owning that power and that voice, even though we have to eat our own fear, a term I learned from my husband who survived the 1965 invasion in his country in the Dominican Republic. He said, tuve que aprender cómo comerme el miedo. And so we have to learn how to eat our fear, right? And that's what I did in creating this company. You know, what ends up happening, though, is that if you look at that picture, that is probably one of the most diverse newsrooms you will see. Thank you. It matters a lot to me. Now we also, besides Latino USA, we produce In the Thick, which just was nominated for a Webby Award. And America by the Numbers for public television. So we've got a lot of work out there. And we get lucky because we get to interview people like Sonia Sotomayor. Yeah, right? And this guy. Lin-Manuel Miranda. I have to show you this story. We were doing this interview with Lin, actually, when I saw him, I've known Lin because I've known him for many, many years, and his father in New York. And when I said to Lin, he had not gone to Broadway yet. They had just started selling tickets. They broke all the records. And I was like, oh my God, Lin, can you believe it? Like, you're the hottest ticket in town, and everybody wants it, and you're like gonna make tons of money, and you're like a huge star. This was before he like blew up. And I said, can you believe it? And he said, mm-hmm. He said, I imagined it like this. In my worst moments, I imagined it like this. So in our worst moments, we have to imagine that we can, in fact, take hold of our own power and eat our fear and not stay stuck and understand the privilege that we have and find that voice from here. And maybe we're not grabbing immigration agents right now, necessarily, but that we are using our voice and using our own narrative and using our power that we have, which is my message to my students here at DePaul, that I love and I teach 6 months out of the year. I hate traveling here, but I love being here with them, is to say, own your power, especially as Latinos from Chicago, especially as Mexicanos from Chicago, especially as Latinos from the Midwest. If you don't think that the world is watching what you are doing, you're wrong. So take my story and own your power. We need it. Gracias.